Thank you for tuning in. I'm Robby Soave, senior editor at Reason Magazine and host of Rising on the Hill, and I'm joined by David Inserra, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute studying free speech.
Free expression and technology.
Fantastic. You have a wonderful new paper that I've read on misinformation and its application to government policy and censorship. This is a topic you think a lot about and I think a lot about, and we want to get into the discussion of it.
Wonderful, yeah. So I wanted to do this paper because we were seeing a lot of conversation in the world about how grave a threat misinformation is. I think it was last year that the World Economic Forum put out a risk report, and it said that the greatest threat facing the world was AI-powered misinformation and disinformation. Not hot wars in Ukraine, not soft wars or potential wars on
not a meteor hitting the planet.
Not climate change. None of what you'd think of, but it was misinformation. And so I wanted to say, okay, well, what is actually going on? Is it as big a threat as we think it is? Or is this something that is overhyped?
One of the things you get into right off the bat in your paper is the struggle over how we even define this concept. So we've probably all heard the words, and if you look at Google search terms over time, there's a massive spike in it. Misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. Sometimes they are used interchangeably. Sometimes they refer to different things. I've seen it defined as misinformation kind of just being wrong information, but then disinformation is if the agenda is the person to mislead you on purpose, and malinformation being something that is true but serves some purpose that is nefarious. Are these the definitions you've heard and that we should even use when we consider these terms?
Great question, yeah. So different experts, first of all, refer to all these terms in slightly different ways. Yes, so misinformation, I think the emerging consensus is that misinformation is provably false or misleading information that isn't intentionally so, and that the disinformation adds that intentionality. It's purposely trying to mislead or to spread false information. And then malinformation isn't used as widely, but it does appear in the acronym of MDM. So some of the experts in this field do use that term to refer to information that isn't provably false. In fact, it's probably true, but maybe it's misleading, but it has an agenda there. And so that one isn't used as often, but it is a definition that we see. That being said, I think the general terminology of misinformation is the one that most people use. And I just think that, unfortunately, that definition of trying to add in that misleading piece, once you include what is misleading, it makes the definition so broad as to effectively be not useful as a term anymore.
Right. And the reason we are talking about this in terms of public policy is the tremendous government effort to study, understand, and in many cases suppress what they have defined as dis, or mal information. This is a term that, to my knowledge, has somewhat of a military origin. If you think of, successful efforts by the U.S. military, the Allies during World War II to convince the Nazis that we're landing on this beach instead of that beach. That's disinformation. And indeed, it comes up a lot in the concept of foreign policy and foreign confrontation. I think, and you suggest that the term really did spike in appeal to a mainstream media sensibility when it was applied to alleged Russian efforts to interfere to the extent that was possible in the 2016 election. But what we've come to understand, and what you write about in your paper, is that the assertions about misinformation made by those people talking about the influence are themselves kind of misleading.
Yeah, exactly. So we can agree that there may have been, and there was, Russian bad actors. There are bad actors that are trying to spread false information. The question comes down to, well, how impactful are those actions? And I think the academic literature on this doesn't support the idea that just because people see misinformation online, they automatically believe it. Instead, misinformation is something where people respond in a variety of ways. People believe it. They act skeptically toward it. They fact check it. They laugh about it. They satirize it. But that complexity is not always reflected in, I think, all of the literature or all the mainstream narrative around this. And so you come away believing that, oh my gosh, people are seeing so much misinformation online. They just see it and they believe it. That's not really the case. In fact, more often than not, misinformation is appealing to people who already have some prior beliefs in an area, and they see misinformation as kind of like, it's too good to check. Like, oh, I already didn't like this candidate. I hear some bad information about them. I'm just going to believe it. Did it actually change how they were acting? No, they already really disliked this person. They happen to go along with it. And that is not something that is having a dramatic impact on our society. It may be false information, and we may want to correct it, and I think that's the job of the media and other institutions. They should correct false information. But the fact that it's having a great impact, it's swaying votes, it's swinging elections, that hasn't been borne out.
Yeah, and then it gets into this very weird philosophical territory. Well, of course, the collective use of or wielding of information has importance or it has some effect, or else I don't know what we're even doing in our lives as people influencing public policy. But is it qualitatively or quantitatively different? Does it validate the kind of, is it a moral panic over how people are consuming information? You know, people said the same things about TV, radio, print, going back. Now, it's possible, of course, right, that there's something really different about getting your information from social media in terms of the viral spread. But you're saying it's not so borne out by the data.
Yeah, the evidence on that is also pretty mixed. Like, there's some reports out there that say, oh, it spreads so fast that the truth can't keep up with it. Well, actually, the truth does keep up with it. Often true social media posts spread very quickly all the time. We also see situations where people who are encountering misinformation, they may not just know much about anything at all. And so when asked by a pollster, hey, is this true or false? They're just guessing. And so the evidence that people are, that their words do matter, and the arguments that we're making, the discussions we have, the information we have does matter, but it's not the case that misinformation, I think, is uniquely popular and uniquely powerful online. The truth also can compete in that space, and it does speak to the fact of, if it's not so powerful, is this just a rehashing of, I think, a long-term issue? And I think it is. You mentioned moral panic. I think that the fights we see, the worry we see over the spreading of new information online is really going back. You can look way back through history to see, you mentioned TV and radio, but you can go back to the Romans and the Greeks, to the Catholic Church and the aristocracy fighting the printing press. There's always a group of people who are looking to hold on to power and their authority, and they're battling against new forms of speech, especially new technologies that threaten those kinds of speech. And we see this current debate over misinformation as just, I think, the latest in the line of panics, moral panics over speech that threatens the authority of the status quo.
What has the U.S. federal government been doing to counter mis and disinformation that is worrying to civil libertarians, civil liberties people, free speech people? Yeah,
so some of the things that we should be worried about is, first, looking at where they are actively just passing laws that say we need to stop doing this, you need to stop that kind of speech, actual censorship. We see this in a couple different places. And for what it's worth, it's on both sides of the political aisle. In the last election, Florida had something on the ballot regarding abortion rights, and there was an abortion rights group that was trying to run an advertisement that said that if we don't do this, women will be harmed as a result. And the health department of Florida came along knocking to the broadcasters and said, hey, this is harmful misinformation. You better knock that off. And thankfully, a judge stepped in and said, hey, you don't get to determine what is true and false. Leave that up to the voters. On the other side of the aisle, you see in California, there was a viral AI-created video of Kamala Harris claiming to be a stooge, hiding her total incompetence. It was all AI-generated, but it made the Democrats in California very upset, and they passed a law that was trying to stop AI satire as speech, and a judge also put a hold on that as well. So government should stop using misinformation as an excuse to just cudgel their political opponents for speech they don't like. So that's the first thing that we see governments doing, is they're just trying to actively intervene with laws. The second thing we see, and you're probably very aware of this, is the government is giving money to organizations to study or stop counter misinformation. And oftentimes that hits important political speech here at home. As you know, the Global Disinformation Index was a British company. The State Department gave it a lot of money, and this organization also had these lists of bad organizations that were spreading really bad misinformation online. reason was top of that list, so congratulations.
Yes.
Now, thankfully, Congress saw that and was like, okay, what's going on here? And they've cut that funding, and I think Secretary Rubio recently removed the last remnants of that institution within the State Department. But there's a lot of other areas in which the government is just giving out grants to study and counter misinformation. But misinformation is such a subjective and loaded term that it inherently means that whatever they're funding is often going to be used to stop political speech. And that's a problem for any American, and we should not want our tax dollars to be used to label our speech or our media speech as misinformation or disinformation.
Your paper rightly spends a lot of time on discourse relating to COVID, health misinformation being the other major category, I think, of this kind of content, in addition to the Russian-derived election stuff. And that was a period of time, the pandemic, where the social media companies seemed most inclined to go along with what we later learned was implicit, maybe sometimes more than implicit, pushing or guidance from federal agencies to make moderation decisions based on what the government was saying that has not aged so well as we have come to even have reasonable, and even the health experts themselves come to question some of the guidance they gave at the time.
Indeed. And I think this is a great example of the way in which, when we're dealing with especially something which is literally in the scientific debate, where we don't know everything we know, there's so many things we don't know, and yet the insistence by health agencies, by knowledge-producing industries, by journalists, and by government to say, no, this is really the right outcome. All their efforts to squelch speech often had, I think, the opposite reaction. You had this sort of Streisand effect, where rather than people saying, oh, I'm probably wrong. I'm glad that my post was taken down. I'm glad that the government was coming after my speech, whatever it might be. Instead, people said, wait a minute, why are you coming after my speech? Maybe I'm onto something. And I think in some cases, they were proven right. Now, don't get me wrong. There was lots of speech during COVID that was just absolute malarkey.
Right.
I was actually working at Med at the time, so I saw plenty of stuff that was just bonkers. But that being said, there was a lot of speech that was also important, and to your point, has been proven true, or at least the questions about whether or not it's clearly and provably false, it's not that case, not that way anymore. The lab leak is obviously the most obvious example of this, but you could also point to various questions about the vaccine itself. We were told the vaccine would, we wouldn't get COVID.
Right.
We wouldn't have the symptoms as bad. We wouldn't spread
Significant
it.
reduction or even elimination of
All
cases.
these promises were made, and it just turns out that, the science got it wrong. They were trying a new thing, good on them, but then to enforce that code on the Americans and to say, and especially to pressure social media companies to take down content. Oh, don't allow that kind of content because that content might prevent someone from getting the vaccines. Well, let people talk about it because it's a emerging area of research and people are likely going to have questions. And we don't get to resolution. You don't encourage people by just sort of telling them, no, you're wrong, do what we say or else. The only way for people to actually become comfortable with these types of things is for them to be able to have honest conversations about these difficult emerging topics. COVID was dominating our lives, and to just tell people to shut up and listen to the government, that has done so much damage to our institutions.
So let's talk about some good ways to deal with potentially harmful speech online then. Many people will say, okay, well, I agree with you that the government shouldn't explicitly order or tell Facebook to take down a post that says getting vaccinated puts a microchip in your arm or something so the government can monitor you. That's a false claim, but government shouldn't do anything about it. Yeah. Whether Facebook wants to do something about that is up to Facebook's discretion. Yeah. Some people would probably say, well, they shouldn't do anything about that either. Others would say, are you kidding? It's a private company. They can do what they want, but it's the responsible choice to take down that kind of content. How do those of us who believe that, who think, well, they can do what they want, but that it's generally healthier to have free speech-esque norms in a discourse space, talk about some of the strategies the social media companies have employed to deal with that speech, and then where you think they've gone right or wrong.
Yeah, so the idea that we should be trying to emulate, the principles that I think social media companies should be searching for are this idea of liberal inquiry, the idea that we should have greater debate and discussion because that's the way that we get at truth. And so their policies should, as much as possible, emulate that we should allow people to discuss things, to challenge beliefs, and to allow, there's no debate that's ever fully settled. That's the idea of liberal inquiry. You kind of see this in the scientific method. We should apply that sort of approach, or at least something akin to it, to our social media policies. And that means things like, we see right now, the adoption of more and more community notes. Community notes being adopted by X, now you see it being adopted by Meta, and even TikTok is rolling out something similar. This resembles the kind of situation where, hey, people from different sides of an issue can agree that this piece of context, this piece of information is important. Okay, that's the way that we come to consensus and we agree that things are true. And for what it's worth, we can later come back and say, it was wrong. It's not going to be perfect, but that method of debate and discussion and trying to bring that into social media, that I think is a healthier way to also build trust in the information that you're seeing versus the alternative, which is to double down on fact checkers, which they don't have, I think, a very good, not a lot of people view them very positively right now. And it's because I think we're at a period in our society, I mentioned there's very low trust in our institutions. That includes the fact checkers and the journalists. Just citing your authority as I'm a journalist, you have to listen to me, that doesn't work, I think, very effectively online. We need to instead emphasize these more, as I said, collaborative ways. You can also give users more choice. Maybe some users are okay seeing more edgy, potentially misleading content. Other users, they want nothing to do with it. They only want the clean, pristine stuff. Okay, maybe give users a choice to pick between those things. That way it's not just one size fits all for everyone online. That's an approach which I think companies could use as well.
Yeah, I want to get back to the user-generated side of it in a minute because I do think that is a fantastic and underexplored solution. In terms of the site having some kind of fact-checking, it really was the case that Facebook and Twitter, they did an experiment where one social media site, Facebook, does a system where appointed experts do the fact-checking, and Twitter X did the opposite kind, where you leave it up to the user base to do a kind of Wikipedia-style, ground-up, user-curated fact-checking, and it's been fairly objectively determined which one worked better. Facebook admits that theirs had a high rate of error, having content restricted on an incorrect basis, where the fact checkers would later admit they got that wrong. That's happened in articles I've written for Reason Magazine, where they've moderated them, and I've said, but wait, you said I said this, and I didn't say this, and they say, oops, you're right. Compared to Twitter X, where usually when I see a community note on a post, that community note is making a valid kind of consider this point that does seem to me to engender a lot more trust in our very politically fraught times. Obviously, there's a lot of conservative people on Twitter. They seem that seems to be an approach that is not only generating less error, but is better appreciated by the people on the platform.
I think that's exactly right. And there are concerns. People will point to say, well, is it fast enough? Because you need time to develop that consensus. But I think that the trade-off is that you're building trust. And I think that trust, at a point where we are very divided and we don't trust our institutions, I think that trust is the highest value that we need to rebuild. And so, yes, no system is going to be perfect, but no development of knowledge ever is. And so we should, I think, trust users to engage in that debate, engage in that conversation, find the areas of consensus, and then, use that common basis of truth or context. Then you can have a more fruitful conversation based on that, as opposed to allowing these fact checkers, which, once again, there are many cases where they'll get it absolutely right, but they only have to get it wrong a few times, and there'll be a pattern start to develop, a bias in which cases they select, a bias in how they determine which content is false or partly false or misleading, and eventually people just say, you know what, I'm just tired of it, and it becomes almost a badge of honor to be fact-checked. Like, what are they doing to me again? I think that has undermined their legitimacy, and I think it has also similarly undermined the legitimacy of many tech companies that use fact-checkers. It's not to say that they can never be right. It's just that I think that we should be going for the trust element that community notes can advance over that of the fact-checkers.
And the user picking the level of moderation that they are comfortable with, as I just said, is, I think, an underutilized possibility. Blue Sky almost allows for something like this, right? Because you can sort of follow, you can pick someone's whose preferences and content generation accords with what you want to see, and then you get like their feed, basically. You could apply that to other social medias where, this is the Robby Soave moderation where where it's very lightly moderated. You're going to see a lot of stuff that could be wrong or could be crazy or could provoke you. Or if you're not comfortable with that, you get the whatever edit where it's going to highly redact and not show you or try to correct things or do whatever. That's the recognition that people are different and want different things, and the standards, if we're talking about private sector innovation, can be different for different people as long as it's voluntarily chosen by those users. Yeah, and I think the key here is that companies are in something of a rock and a hard place. There's a writer named Mike Masnick who calls it his impossibility theorem. The idea that you cannot moderate perfectly, you cannot moderate well at scale for millions of posts where people have different beliefs. It's not possible. So, I mean, even think of it at the video versus word space. Exactly. I create a lot of content on YouTube. The number of new hours of content that appears on the platform every second is astonishing. It's amazing. And so trying to be able to just the logistics of doing that moderation and to do it effectively means you're always going to have tons of false positives. You're going to get things wrong a lot. But even just putting those aside, you then are going to have policies that artificially restrict, we're just not comfortable with this because we perceive there's some sort of harm here. Well, there's disagreement about that harm. And outside of the areas where there truly is objective harm, things are illegal, or content that, as a company, I really don't care. I don't want nudity on my platform. You just don't want that. There are lines you can draw, but there's still space for companies to say, you know what, there's a large space here where we could say, we just disagree. People disagree. Maybe we have our default setting, our preferred policies are the default setting. But yeah, we'll allow you to opt into other people's options. Blue Sky does do something similar to this. Other decentralized forms of social media do allow people to sort of opt into different moderation tools. And those are definitely smaller, but Blue Sky is, I think, one of the first examples of this gaining significant popularity. But you also have Reddit, where it's sort of that way. If you don't like this group, you can go join a different group, and the rules are different in different groups to a certain extent. So giving more power to users is, I think, a good idea. And you also see it even in some of the mainstream platforms. You see Instagram and Facebook, for example, both increasingly giving users more choice. They recently allowed you to use other people's feed choices as your choice. So I think they're recognizing that the one-size-fits-all policy might be a little restrictive and is driving some people away from the platform to some of their competitors. And so going with user choice, I think, can be good for their business model and good for expression online. Let's talk about some harder cases, because I think some people will hear what we're saying and say, yeah, the restriction of COVID-related speech was way over the top, and the Russia stuff was, not well-founded after you actually looked into it. So with you on the content, but is AI something different? Is now the ability to generate images that are not that actual thing, that are still at the level where we can mostly tell the difference, but it could get a lot better? And does it start to get into, even the Kamala Harris video, which, that is satire, and it's easy enough to determine it, but on some level, if it's impressive enough to fool people, does then it just become defamation or libel or copyright infringement, categories where there are First Amendment exceptions? We do have a couple categories of Supreme Court recognized speech that they have said you can have that outlawed. Do we start to touch on those categories? I think this is a classic case of the laws as currently exist should continue to exist and apply to the new technology, and that will be something of a process. The internet and social media has upended the way in which we engage in conversation. That is a challenge. Those are real growing pains there. But that doesn't mean that we need to just sort of scrap this, Supreme Court jurisprudence and say we need new rules that just override the old way of doing things. No, we can say we are largely going to still allow this content to users to figure out and to work through things. And while AI is a powerful tool, people said you can go back and find similar things about people talking about early editing of granular photos or just Photoshop itself. We've learned how to live with those technologies, despite the fact that at the time they were also viewed as significant threats to our ability to know what is true. There will be growing pains. There are challenges associated with that. But the answer is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
the discussion and the free expression that we have, that is the better way to identify truth, as opposed to assigning some sort of authority to some government or to some sort of expert class.
Well, especially before we properly understand the technology and see all of its applications, right? I think there's such a danger in over-regulating something as it's still being developed, especially when we want to remain globally competitive with other people who are experimenting with where AI technology can go. And also, frankly, even with the experience with copyright has led to a lot of chilling of speech and expression. We who are creating internet videos all the time run into, well, can we use this music? Can we use this clip? It's genuinely unclear in some cases from a legal standpoint, but you don't ever want to risk it. And so a lot of norms have developed around this category of speech that I think are overly restrictive. And if push came to shove and you had it before the Supreme Court, I think they would actually say, no, you can do that. But people are so afraid because of the chilling effect that copyright stuff has had.
I think some of us all have some experiences with the DMCA, and we won't have to go into that. But yeah, the reality is that, like I said, existing laws will be applied. We'll work through it. Common law process, we'll figure out these cases. And you mentioned, coming back to AI specifically, AI is also a tool for folks who want to use it to gain knowledge and to figure out what is good and what is true. So it is, yes, a tool that can be used by bad actors to create, clearly false videos and to try to mislead people, but it's also a tool that we can help use to improve our own knowledge. Like, I don't know about you, but nowadays you see at top of Google or many other places, you get a quick summary of all this information rather than scrolling through all the Google pages trying to figure out what is true and what is not. AI is already helping me gain information faster and better than I would have if I had to go read all those articles myself and digest them and synthesize them.
It kind of reminds me of how Wikipedia itself was treated when we were a lot younger. It was almost shameful to admit that you were using Wikipedia to generate, to get some knowledge of some topic. There's it's not accurate, blah, blah, blah. Now, I don't think anyone bats an eyelash at admitting if they quickly had to bring themselves up to speed on some topic, that you would certainly start with Wikipedia and have a high level of accuracy about the topic. AI could be that in 5 or 10 years or sooner, or later, but sooner.
Exactly. And so that's another example of how new technologies are upending the way maybe we used to figure out how we figured out what is true and what is false. But rather than just focus on the negatives and just overly regulate, to your point, not just harming ourselves, but harming our competitiveness in the world stage in which we are competing with the likes of China. And you can already see this in places like the EU, where they have regulated themselves completely out of the race, and where their tech industry is it just can't compete. So we don't want to end up like Europe, where we just have so many rules and regulations where we can't speak freely, we can't develop, we can't innovate. We should embrace the technology, recognize there will be some mistakes and difficulties along the way, but we should maintain the belief in this sort of liberal order, this liberal values. That's the way we make progress.
Well, and it has made us so much more technologically competitive because of Section 230 and the First Amendment that protects online speech and takes the burden away from the company to try to take down speech because they're going to be threatened by some of the things we're talking about. Europe, for instance, has taken the exact opposite approach, creating a whole system of bureaucratic-derived rules to strangle tech innovation. You have some suggestions for the government. This is a policy paper, and people are very concerned about the implicit threatening of social media companies to get them to take down content. That was there. Trump has had an executive order to try to reverse that. Talk about the job-owning category, the transparent, mandating transparency versus actually outright prohibiting communication between the government and the companies. What are the pluses and minuses of these approaches?
Yeah, so when we're dealing with misinformation, which we saw a lot of during COVID, this Supreme Court case, Murphy v. Missouri, we saw this go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sort of punted on it and said, you don't have standing, so we're not going to really solve the problem, but it's going to be hard for you guys to prove that the government did, definitely did you guys wrong. In this case, it's hard to prove always that the government, their specific communication that they sent directly led to this content being taken down. And that's what the Supreme Court found. But the more fundamental issue is that I think the court maybe missed and punted on was there's a broad amount of speech that's happening where the companies are being pressured, yelled at, being constantly told to do something. And while the threat isn't necessarily always explicit, sometimes it's just like, well, if you don't do this, we don't have to help you in those trade negotiations. We don't have to help you in those negotiations with the EU. You can see Meta President Nick Clegg explicitly saying that, like, we have to move here because otherwise the Biden administration is going to screw us on this issue. That is not a good place to be as an American company where you're worried that your government is not going to help you if you don't take the right free speech action. And for what it's worth, you could apply the same thing to what's going on right now under the Trump administration.
Absolutely.
The point is that you want transparency into what the governments are saying to these companies. Because sometimes companies legitimately want to hear from the government. So that's the challenge of, you can just say we're going to prohibit it, you can't do it. But then it becomes a little bit of a guessing game, a difficult balance to strike. Do you say, no, you can't communicate at all, the government can't communicate at all with the private companies? Well, then that risks silencing, I think, important speech that the company wants to hear from the government. We don't know what's going on here. Can you give us more information? And the government's like, sorry, I can't do that because the law says I can't. But if you go too lenient and you allow too much speech, well, then you could basically say, oh, public safety emergency like COVID, we can do whatever we can say whatever we want to private companies.
Right.
So
And to give tangible examples of the former category, I mean, law enforcement actions. Most people would say if the FBI has some knowledge of some sexually exploitative for underage people or terrorist activity, I think this is a group for ISIS, most people are going to say that it is legitimate for the FBI or whoever it is to contact Facebook about that.
Yes.
How do we allow that while saying, but we don't think it was appropriate for the CDC to tell Facebook X, Y, and Z?
And even when it's not explicitly illegal, you could point to examples of, you can think of issues where, imagine there's a CIA agent who's, their identity is about to be outed. And you could see, them saying, racing, say, take this down, we need to get our guy out, then you can leave it up. But
sure,
this is the kind of thing that, legacy journalists would do all the time. Like, we have a story, we have a scoop, but we're going to give you a chance to, save the good guys, get them out of country before we leak the identity. That's okay. That seems to be an acceptable conversation.
Like exactly what Jeffrey Goldberg did with the Houthi story, right? He didn't publish the plans to blow up that building before it happened. He didn't spoil the war effort, but it was still a scoop.
Exactly. So we want some of that conversation to occur, but we don't want the conversation to become so constant and so sort of have so much pressure associated with it that the companies feel like they have no choice. And the best way to do that is just through transparency. Just have the government say what asks they're making of the private companies, and then release. And of course, they're subject to things like FOIA and privacy restrictions. But the idea being that we know, generally speaking, what our government is communicating to private companies about, and if they're trying to censor our content, then we know, and then we can go to the courts with it. But right now, we're just sort of shooting in the dark, and we don't know what they're doing at all. And that's why the Murphy v. Missouri case was such a big one, because that was one where they actually got discovery. They actually found out a lot more. But that was a long road just on this one area of content. And so I think we want to know more in the future just to prevent any administration from being able to apply this kind of pressure on companies.
Yeah, if we had known how much of the moderation decisions we were uncomfortable with were motivated by government job owning, all along without Elon Musk having to buy one of the companies and go through the emails, I think it would have changed things.
I definitely think that, it's a remarkable, you point out Elon Musk, there's so much about these stories that we wouldn't know had that not happened. And it shouldn't be left to the American public to hope that we're going to get that kind of change in the future just to figure out what was going on. We should just know what our government is doing, supposedly on our behalf, to stop dangerous speech. We're adults. Let's talk about what kind of speech we think is dangerous. The government can say it. And if it really is terrorist content, if it's going after, it's saving the CIA or the undercover operative, great. That's wonderful. They're out of country already. We're good. If it's, I don't like this misinformation about COVID, please take it down, well, then we can say, no, government, that's not your role, and we can hold them accountable.
David Inserra of the Cato Institute. It's a terrific new paper. Thanks so much for watching.